Well, joining us now is military analyst and former British Army officer Colonel Simon Diggins and former British Army captain Patrick Berry. I'm going to start with you, Simon. I mean, the big conversation that's being had, I suppose, politically is whether or not this is going to eventually lead to an escalation, whether the strategy of Iran backing the Houthi rebels is to continue to incrementally up the ante every single time, and that there is a risk, perhaps, that if the Houthi rebels respond, they've threatened to do so, and we respond again, and so on and so forth. It's almost following a strategy that Tehran has preordained.
I'm not sure that I would agree with that. I think what we do know is that Iran has backed in the past the Houthis, it backed Hamas, and it's backed Hezbollah as part of its aim to try and establish some kind of regional proxies within the area. But more recently, and from about April 22 onwards, but very much from April 23 onwards as well, for over this last year to 18 months, there's been another sign of what Iran actually wants. Iran has now joined the organization that was formerly known as BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And it joined at exactly the same time as Saudi Arabia. So what we saw prior to the October the 7th attack by Hamas was a bit of a reorientation of the nature of the powers within the Middle East. We saw signs of an early rapprochement between Israel and South Africa. We saw then the Iran and Saudi Arabia rapprochement. So there's probably at least two streams going on there. There's, if you like, an old loyalty to what they've termed the axis of resistance, and certainly a high degree of rhetoric supporting that, and they don't want to go back away from them. But there's another grouping within Iran saying this is not in our long-term interests. So the issue whether it then escalates further is really which of those groupings is going to be dominant in the future. Now, it's not clear, therefore, why the Houthis and Hamas attacked when they did, given that they could have attacked at any particular time. It appears to me that one of the reasons they did this, one of the reasons why Hamas attacked in October, was to try and destabilize this growing rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia. And the Houthis also effectively disenfranchised because there's been a peace settlement, at least ongoing in the area since April 22, also looking to try and say, we're still here. We're still fighting an internal civil war. We're still looking for a position of dominance within Yemen. So there are these internal dynamics within the region, which are not directly related to what's gone on between Israel and the Palestinians, except through Hamas saying we're also part of this, and Iran itself perhaps looking in two directions at the same time. It's been very interesting to see which of these things plays out in the end.
Let's bring in Patrick Berry, a former Army officer, British Army officer. Thanks for joining us, Patrick. I mean, Simon went some way towards answering the question that I want to ask you, but I'd be interested in your thoughts as well. I mean, I don't think we had any choice, the Americans, the British and the Allies, but to retaliate, but to do what we did last night, to send the Houthis a message. You attack cargo ships in the Red Sea and there will be consequences, serious consequences. And I expect all this to happen again. But this is what the Houthis clearly wanted. They were clearly being provocative. They were provoking us into a response. So my question to you is, what are they playing at?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think Simon's done a really good job in terms of painting the picture there, and it was chiming with some of my thoughts about it. Like, first of all, you've got to look at Iran here, really, and the first question, as Simon alluded to, is how fractured are they actually internally, and how teetering is the regime and the results of that. And that became it's a complex question of which certainly someone like me sitting here in the University of Bath doesn't have all the intelligence for, but. And then how much control do they have over the Houthis? We know that they've trained them, we know that they've traveled to naval facilities. We know that they're equipping them with their missiles, with their drones. You would presume that that goes hand in hand with some sort of influence, of course, but I don't know the actual degree of that. And certainly the relationship with Iran and the Houthis is relatively modern compared to like Iran and Hezbollah, which it has a lot of control over and it basically helps set up. So there's that question. And then finally, of course, as you're alluding to, is the Houthis themselves. What do they want from here? And I think Simon's made a really good point there about, this is about their being the dominant power in their country, and also waving the flag in the region. Don't forget about us. But I do think, the Houthis aren't particularly interested in massive diplomacy with the West, who they view as on side with Israel. They're not really interested in more targeted operations against just Israeli shipping. They either can't do it or they don't care. And they've said they're going to respond. So I would expect, more likely than not, there'll be some sort of another counter fire from the Houthis if they have the capability and it's still retained, and if they're not reined in by Iran. And then there'll be further strikes by the Western Alliance as a result.
Simon, coming back to you, it's interesting. This programme is nominally about the airstrikes in Yemen, and yet the country's name that pops up far more often is Iran. And you were just in depth talking about the splits in that country. But there are also splits in the West when it comes to how to operate Iran, if you will. And there's two schools of thought, let's say. There's the Obama school of thought, which is let's get around a negotiating table, let's have a proper dialogue with them in the hope that they will back off and stop behaving in such a hostile manner. Then there's the Trump school of thought, is you can't negotiate with people like this. You give them an inch, they're going to take a mile. Certainly what we have seen is to some degree a thawing of relationships and some efforts being made to reopen the JCPOA. But has that been the right approach? How does the West deal with a problem like Iran?
With a great deal of caution, and it probably needs to be very modest in what it can try and achieve. I mean, containment, much in the same way as in the late 1940s, as the West struggled to deal with the Soviet Union and the development of the Warsaw Pact, it came up with this doctrine of containment. And I think containment is probably what you're trying to do with Iran. And I don't think we're in a position at the moment yet to see what you might regard as significant regime change. And there's certainly absolutely no appetite to try and interfere directly inside Iran, and indeed very unclear that anything such thing would have any direct effect. So you're in a position of containment and perhaps dealing with each issue on a one-by-one basis. It is clear that what happened with Obama and that the conversations around the JCPOA did not work out. I'm not sure that interesting that Trump would be quite so oppositional. He has that bizarre characteristic of always thinking he can make a deal. You'll recall in the last Trump presidency, he was there talking with the North Korean leader. It wouldn't just be beyond him to try and do something similar with the Iranians as well.
Don't forget
he had that sort of chutzpah.
Yeah, don't forget his best-selling book, The Art of the Deal. Let's go back to you, Patrick. I mean, let me put a very naive question to you, because I am very naive. Iran, we know they're pulling all the strings. They're the puppeteer here. They're the puppeteer who sent Hamas into the Gaza Strip. They're the puppeteer that inspire Hezbollah. They're the puppeteer that fund and arm the Houthis. And yet, so they'll be. It strikes me, Iran will be perfectly happy to see the Yemen being bombed by the West. So my question to you is, why don't we sort of cut out the middleman? And if we know they're doing that it's all Iran's fault, why don't we drop bombs on them?
Yeah, and I think there is that's always been a debate in the US administration for the last at least 10 years, and there's been hawks on Iran and doves. And so far, the doves have generally been the more cautious and won out that debate, even though at times it's come close to it, especially, I think, in 2011 when the Israelis were itching to go, and eventually, even before that, maybe did. But yeah, there's a question there. Look, Iran has been a malign influence basically for over 40 years, and in particular in the last 20 years. I'm not sure where Simon served. I served in Afghanistan, and they had an influence there. They had a major influence in Iraq as well. And unfortunately, Iraq actually increased the strength of their hand. And since then, they've grown it really. And their overall aim is to create a kind of Shia arc present in the region and remain one of the major players on even the world stage. There is something to be said for it. The cautious, the constrained strategy is a US strategy, and it's really being used everywhere. They're trying to constrain China. They're trying to constrain the conflict in the Middle East and Iran. They're trying to constrain Russia in Ukraine. The question is, if you're going to do that, a containment strategy, even if you're going to do that, you have to be confident that the status quo is in your long-term interest and benefit over the longer term. I don't have privy, to all the data on that. Certainly, Chinese economy is in dipping, and the Russian economy is on a war footing, but we'll see how sustainable that is. Obviously, the American one is doing very well at the moment. So it becomes a question of strategy, really. Funny enough, there's a window of opportunity here with Russia engaged and probably China not ready to take on Taiwan. There is actually, some argument to be made. There's a window of opportunity here in the strategic sense with which degrading the Iranian military, and in particular the IRGC's capability in setting them back, not regime change or anything like that, but might make more sense actually in the short term. And then you'd have to pivot to your other threats, strategic threats, which are coming down the line. So I wouldn't be surprised if these are exactly the debates that are going on in the administration in the US, at least at the moment. I mean, Biden's strategy was, he wanted to, through his foreign policy, was to basically focus on the rise of China and pivot to China, extend what Obama had tried and then got distracted with. And unfortunately, the way events have turned out, he's had to obviously focus on Russia and then on the Middle East, and actually try to seek a rapprochement with China, which, at least there's some military-to-military dialogue going on there. So I think it's been the table's really been flipped on American containment foreign policy as a la Biden anyway.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating, talking about containment foreign policy, especially when you look at the development and the enhancement of BRICS, and then you realise that if you join the dots, you've got some burgeoning relationships between Russia, Iran, China. But overhanging all of this, I suppose, and I'm going to come back to you on this, Simon, is Iran and the threat of them getting a nuclear weapon. And somewhere behind all of this is the nuclear deal we once had with Iran and the fact that they have been going great guns in enriching uranium. Should we be very concerned about that?
I think so. I think it's one of the things that most people would agree, even those who would probably be on the side of containment in many circumstances with Iran. The one thing nobody really wants them to have is a nuclear weapon. And of course, that's exactly the kind of thing they're trying to develop for that reason. I mean, they've kind of looked around and worked out where the US intervened successfully, and all of them have been powers that were non-nuclear powers. Iraq was an example of a country that obviously attempted to have a nuclear capability and at some point stopped doing so, but they didn't keep the rhetoric down, and we ended up in 2003, 2004 going after weapons of nuclear mass destruction that didn't actually exist, but they didn't really, we couldn't trust them with that. So the issue of whether Iran ever makes a nuclear weapon is key to it. And I think in terms of strategic intelligence focus is one of the key priorities, understanding where they are with that. Now, that might well be the trigger if people believe they had the potential. That might well be the trigger for some kind of preemptive military strike, saying up with this we will not put, as the Israelis did with the Iraqis in an earlier stage. So I think that's something which would be a game changer in terms of the debate that Patrick's identified correctly between the hawks who say bomb on Iran. And remember, that was McCain, who was a real opponent of Trump, but he was very much a proponent of bombing Iran. And those who say, no, we can deal with them through negotiation and through other ways of containing and engagement with them. So that is a live debate.
Absolutely. Simon Diggins and Patrick Bury, thank you so much for talking to us. Fascinating stuff.
Yeah,
Thank you.
really interesting.